DAC is interested in, we are fighting to defund the sheriff and decarcerate our jails and build out community health in Alameda County. And in that process of building out, community-based mental health, we have been asked by multiple groups, and we have also asked ourselves to take a position on locked treatment facilities. And as we work to build out this continuum of care, we think that it is important for DAC, kind of one of the largest grassroots groups in this struggle, to learn about it from our allies and our comrades, both locally and regionally, with lived experience and with expertise on this issue. And so in order for our steering committee to come up and our members to kind of help inform this decision, we've decided to host this roundtable discussion with folks that we are, deeply in the struggle with, deeply respect. So I really appreciate you all for joining us and, taking time out of your Wednesday night to be here. So just so you all know, I'll just do a few housekeeping things and then we'll get started. This tonight is a roundtable discussion just for our active members. These are folks who are in our working groups, who are throwing down with us, and for the steering committee to learn from folks from a diverse, who take a diverse set of positions on this issue. I want to bring up some shared agreements that I want to ask all of us to abide by, since this can be a very personal topic, and one that is also a bit hard to digest. So some of the shared agreements I hope we all going to take on, and I want to ask you all to take on, is to come from a place of deep respect, humbleness, curiosity, to really be an active listener, to be very mindful of how you're showing up, and to recognize that this is an educational experience. We all have so much to learn from each other, even if we don't agree on everything, right? And that's why they call organizing a struggle sometimes. Like I said, this discussion will help DAC make an informed decision on where we stand on locked treatment facilities. But even more than that, it's an opportunity for us to learn from each other. Rebecca, raise your hand. Rebecca Ruiz from Anti-Police Terror Project. She's another fellow DAC steering member. She will be keeping time. So we have about 6 speakers, and we want to give everyone the same amount of time. So she will be having, kind of like similar to public comment, a live timer, and she will be giving, for the speakers, she will be giving you a 30-second warning that will look just like that when you have exactly 30 seconds left. And you will also hear a little dingy ding sound when your time is up, and we'll just move to the next speaker after you. For speakers, there will be 2 rounds of questions. The first question, you'll get 3 minutes. The second question, you'll have 5 minutes. And we just really ask that you respect the time so that our members also have time to discuss their reflections as well. And we really care what our members think. So that's why we're kind of being very stringent about time. The speakers feel free to, speak to one another. I will have Ivette Ale go first because she has to leave at 6:30. So she'll start every round. And just in terms of a little context, in terms of how we curated the panel, we really strive to curate a balanced and diverse panel. So people who have lived experience, people who do live with serious mental illness, people who are family members, people who have organized around this topic far longer than us, both locally and regionally. So we're not only hearing from people who are based in Alameda County, but we're learning from people who've worked on this elsewhere. So we really thought about the diversity of perspectives. We actually don't know what all of our speakers' stances are. We know a few, but we don't know all of them. So we're actually going to be learning about what most of the speakers' stances are here today. And yeah, with that, I'm really excited to get started. And yeah, I'm going to invite Rebecca to just introduce our speakers, and then yeah, and then we'll learn from each other.
Great. So we have 6 panelists with us today. I'm going to give a quick intro, but I just want to say thank you to everyone coming out, and thank you to the panelists for coming on, sharing your thoughts with us on these issues. First, we have Senior Raia Small with Senior Disability Action. Raia Small organizes at Senior Disability Action for voluntary mental health services and against the expansion of conservatorship. She grew up in San Francisco, has a mental health disability, and believes that all disabled people deserve to live with autonomy, dignity, and connection. We also have Clio Sady with us today. Clio is a queer disabled cartoonist and activist with bipolar 1 and has been repeatedly institutionalized, leading them to an abolitionist framework. Clio has also been a volunteer with MHFirst, a non-police crisis response project of the Anti-Police Terror Project. We also have Ivette Ale with JusticeLA. Ivette is a queer Latinx grassroots organizer and advocate leading campaigns to reform the criminal legal system in California. Their history growing up in Southern California as an undocumented person and as a child of an incarcerated person has informed their activism throughout their career. As the campaign coordinator for JusticeLA, Ivette led the coalition to historic victories, including ending the LA County's $3.5 billion jail expansion in 2019, the adoption of Los Angeles County's groundbreaking alternatives to incarceration roadmap, and the passing of Measure J in 2020. They serve as senior policy lead for Dignity Empowered Now and is a co-founder of La Defense. We also have Olivia Park with us today from the Do No Harm Collective, the Do No Harm Coalition. Olivia is a physician, street medic, and one of the founders of Do No Harm, as well as a member of the MHFirst core team of clinical professionals. We have Margot Dashiell here with us today from the East Bay Supportive Housing Collaborative. Margot is a retired community college instructor. She's a family member of 4 people over 3 generations who've lived with or are currently living with serious mental illness. For 23 years, she has led the Alameda County Mental Health Association's African American Family Support Group. We also have Katy Polony, who is from National Alliance of Families Advocating for Seriously Mentally Ill. Katy says, I have a son with schizophrenia who lives with me. I'm on the board of directors of the National Association on Mental Illness, East Bay. I'm one of the organizers of Families Advocating for the Seriously Mentally Ill, and I'm the family advocate with In-Home Outreach Team, which is a small team who are tasked with getting folks with severe mental illness connected to services, whether they're living on the streets in Santa Rita or at home. So all week I work with people mostly on the psychotic spectrum and their families. Welcome, speakers. Really glad you guys could join us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for introducing them all, Rebecca. So I'm just putting in the chat the first question that all folks have, all speakers have about 3 minutes to answer, and we'll start with Ivette. So Ivette, how did we get here? Can you share from your perspective the context and history of placing people with serious mental illness in locked facilities, and just feel free to share what you know.
Yeah, I mean, I could speak for my experience here in Los Angeles. So not just in Los Angeles, but across the state, mental health facilities closed with the promise of community-based mental health treatment, right? But that promise of community-based mental health treatment was not fulfilled. There was no investment in it. And instead, local counties and the state highly invested, and I would say wasted, dollars into incarceration, into punitive responses to mental health crises, to violence in the community. And we saw a boom of both jail and prisons across the state as a response to that crisis rather than investment in services. Here in Los Angeles County, that meant an explosion in our jail population. And here in LA County, we actually have the largest mental health facility in the country, and that's the mental health jail in here in LA County. And so we saw a huge shift in treatment from the asylum model, which was not great, right? These locked facilities were not helpful, but no investment into that alternative of community-based treatment, and instead building of a really large, expansive carceral state. And here in LA County, we have the largest jail system on the planet. And so more people with mental health needs are spending time in jails instead of treatment here in LA County, and more people overall are spending time inside of jails instead of with their families and communities anywhere else in the world. So that's the context for the issue. And I'll stop there. I know we're short on time. So that's the context for LA County.
So because you have 1 more minute left, so we're here trying to make a decision on locked treatment facilities, right?
Yeah.
Did JusticeLA take a stance on that? I did see that there was a conservatorship recommendation in your plan, but because you have a minute left, I want to.
Yeah. So just a little background and context. The county, starting in 2014, 2015, was contemplating building a new mental health jail to replace a men's central jail. Men's central jail is dilapidated, it's dangerous, it's toxic, just like any other jail. But the alternative was to create a new fancy jail. And it's important to remember the history here. When Twin Towers was created here in LA County, it was pitched as a new state-of-the-art jail where folks were going to receive better treatment. But we saw that it just devolved into the same model as any other locked facility. The county was moving on the mental health jail. They had already approved it. They had already done the environmental impact statement. And then we were able to successfully stop the construction of the jail. And then they came back and they said, oh, well, we're going to create a mental health hospital, but it's going to be run by the sheriff, and it's going to be a locked facility. And so we called it as what it was, a mental health jail. So we took a stance of no locked facilities, including a mental health hospital, AKA another jail.
Okay, thank you so much for clarifying that. Up next, we'll have Margot. Margot, from your perspective, can you share just a little bit of history on how you think we got here? Margot, you're on mute. Margot, can you unmute yourself?
I would agree
Awesome.
with what Ivette has said about the state hospital and the closing down of facilities, and yet the underinvestment in the community. And where I think we have underinvested is in making for excellent psychiatric hospitals. I do think there's a role for locked facilities, both acute and subacute, and there is a big role for supportive housing, including licensed board and cares, and that's the continuum of care. And that's where we don't have adequate investment along that continuum. And I think we don't have it because we don't have enough public voice calling for it. There just isn't sufficient constituency for it. And I thank DAC for being here, for organizing, for looking at these issues. It's very well appreciated. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, it looks like if you don't have anything to add, Margot, we can restart the timer and hit it to the next person. We'll pass it to Clio. Clio, from your perspective, can you share, the context and history of, what you know around placing people with serious mental illness in locked treatment facilities?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for asking me to be a part of this. I'm really honored to be here. Medical racism shapes the psychiatric system with roots in the enslavement of Black Americans. For example, psychiatric disorders dreamed up by Samuel A. Cartwright in 1851, pathologizing enslaved people running away or resisting work. It shares the racist origin of the prison industrial complex. The critique of psychiatric institutions parallels the critique of jails and prisons because mental illness and madness are criminalized. Locked beds or involuntary treatment disproportionately target Black and brown people. Psychiatry in its history and present pathologized dissent. In 1968, psychiatrists added aggressive to the definition of schizophrenia and marketed pharmaceuticals directly to Black patients who they felt were out of control. Also, the racist overdiagnosis of oppositional defiance disorder is a feature of the school to prison pipeline. Schizophrenia is overdiagnosed, with Black men 6 times more likely to be diagnosed than white men, and less stigmatized diagnoses such as depression are underdiagnosed among BIPOC. Block treatment facilities share features with jail or prison, including the presence of police, forced confinement, forced medical treatment, restraint, chemical restraint, and well-documented environments fostering physical and sexual abuse. In my opinion, an abolitionist approach must include the abolition of forced treatment in psychiatric hospitals. They're part of the carceral state and the culture of confinement. They are warehousing people, a method of removing houseless people to facilitate gentrification.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You have 1 minute left. Do you have anything else you want to add?
Just like a strong stance against forced psychiatric treatment. I'll talk about it more, but my experiences firsthand with being locked up in institutions, including John George here in Alameda County.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. We will pass it to Katy Polony with FASMI to share your perspective on the context of how we got here. Katy, you are muted. Please unmute yourself. We want to hear from you.
Hi, thank you for having me, and I'm definitely going to use all my 3 minutes. So where are we in Alameda County? And when I refer to locked hospital beds, I'm referring to our public psychiatric hospital beds, which are John George and which is our acute facility, and 3 subacute facilities, the primary one being Villa Fairmont. And I'm going to speak in favor of these facilities and the necessity for locked beds. The number of public hospital beds that we currently have in Alameda County is 256. The number of folks with serious mental illness in a county the size of Alameda would be roughly 63,000, assuming that 4% of the population is on the psychotic spectrum or has bipolar disorder. The Treatment Advocacy Center estimates that a county like Alameda with a population of 1.6 million would need a minimum of 1,000 beds. The California Hospital Association estimates the need to be 824. Since 1995, we have seen a drop by over 20% of our psychiatric beds in California. And this is again from the California Hospital Association. Quoting a document released by SAMHSA, the Federal Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in 2019, entitled Unintended Consequences, Where We Are Today, I quote, "Current commitment criteria makes it nearly impossible to be admitted involuntarily to a hospital for inpatient care. Families must watch loved ones who are nonviolent decompensate to the point of being unable to care for themselves." And I'm going to add, and often devolve into violence. So how did we get here? I'm going to start with World War II, when conscientious objectors were sent to work in the huge mental institutions of the day, and the conditions they saw and documented there were horrid. I refer you to a Life magazine expose titled Bedlam, 1946. The conditions were horrifying, but no more so than what we see on our streets. And the conditions for our folks in prison are medieval. There's a book called Crazy by Pete Early, which is excellent on that. Following these revelations, a number of things happened in the 50s and 60s. We saw the introduction of the first antipsychotics with high hopes that those with SMI could now live successfully on their own. Kennedy proposed emptying the hospitals and replacing them with what he called community mental health centers, which, as we know, were never funded properly and which concentrated on counseling and psychotherapy and not taking responsibility for those leaving the hospitals. There developed a counter argument that doubted the existence of mental illness and an anti-psychiatry movement that exists today, and a patients' rights movement. And last but not least, when we got federal Medicare and Medicaid in the we also got the IMD exclusion, the Institute of Mental Disease exclusion. This means that the federal government will not reimburse states the cost of psychiatric hospitalization.
You gotta wrap up, Katy.
16 beds will help. Okay, we don't want to return to the conditions of the 40s. We do not want patients' rights to be eliminated. But as we often hear said, the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction. Hospitalization is sometimes in the best interest of the patient. We don't have enough to meet the need. I work in IHOT. I see this daily. We can't even get people that are living incoherently on the street with festering wounds and bugs crawling in and out of them, hospitalized for medical care. If they don't want to get on a stretcher, we have to leave them on the street. Us families call that the right to die on the streets with your rights on.
Thank you, Katy. Up next, we got Raia to share some history and context from their perspective.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I've already learned a lot from each of the panelists, and I really admire your work here at Decarcerate Alameda. So I wanted to give some of the earlier historical context. In the United States, institutions began developing in the 19th century, and these institutions housed people not only with what we would now identify as serious mental illness, but also syphilis, epilepsy, dementia, Alzheimer's, and alcoholism, and developmental disabilities as well. And the patient population increased rapidly in the late 19th century. And the approach of treatment was known as moral treatment, which meant seeking to cure patients by exposing them to normal behavior. And that often included working in workshops or on farms. And in this context of institutionalization was happening, at the time of industrialization, the growth of cities, the breakup of families and rural communities, the Civil War and the end of slavery and transition to wage labor, and westward expansion. And as Clio mentioned, also cultural anxiety about mental illness was part of anxiety about whiteness, in particular, the fear of free Black people and the fear that poor whites would degrade the race by having children with disabilities. And one example of that is a hypothetical mental illness called drapetomania, which a white doctor, Samuel Cartwright, proposed in 1851 to explain why some enslaved people ran away. So he basically said that it was caused by a mental illness, not caused by just like the very universal desire to be free. And the treatment for drapetomania was the amputation of both big toes of an enslaved person to prevent them from running away. And also, I'm sorry that some of this is like kind of triggering, and I probably should have given a content warning before beginning. So yeah, just apologies for that. And so another thread in this history is the creation of ugly laws, which happened between 1867 and 1974. They were local laws that banned, quote unquote, unsightly beggars from being in public. And the punishment was incarceration or fines. So this was targeted at people with all kinds of visible disabilities or apparent mental illness. And people were also told not to give money to beggars and instead to give them medical treatment or rehabilitation through punishment. Okay, I see I'm running out of time, so I just wanted to mention eugenics, which became popular in the late 19th, early 20th century, and forced sterilization, which happened in a lot of institutions at this time and up until the 70s. A third of sterilizations happened in California. Yeah, I guess as some of the other speakers mentioned, in the 60s and 70s, the disability rights movement pushed against institutions and locked beds for care and services in the community, but the funding for that never really came through because of neoliberal austerity. And instead, now we have most people with disabilities, including mental illness, in prisons. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Raia. And then we are going to Olivia.
Hi, this is Leo. I'm gonna try to get him off of me. How did we get here? I think everyone has touched on parts of it. I think like a lot of the roots of our current problems, they are white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, and then tied in there colonialism. I think that is how we got here, sort of like in a broad brushstroke. And I had just a little bit of time to think about this, like between seeing patients, and today we had to send another teenager to a locked psychiatric facility. And I don't know how I know how we got here. You know, Clio mentioned the history. I mean, everyone's touched on, you know, this like promise of investment into communities and then the like deinstitutionalization. But I think even before that, the criminalization of the mentally ill and the pathologization, is that a word? When you pathologize someone or something or a culture or a community, when you the pathologization of the other, more specifically people who were enslaved, African Americans, and people who identify as Black and Indigenous people of color. Like those two those are inextricably tied. And I see it every day in my work. And I don't have facts and numbers to tell you because I have a hard time learning that way, but I have a couple of stories of patients. Like I saw a patient who's a young woman who had severe heart failure, and psych consult was called on her while in the hospital. They said, oh, she has a blunt affect. She seems to have, you know, bizarre thinking. And I was doing my psych rotation at the time, and I went to go see her. She was just a person who had gone through a lot. She was a Black woman whose heart was failing, and nobody was going to give her a heart transplant because she was unhoused, because she has a history of addiction. And so we were keeping therapies that are available and interventions that are available from her because of her mental illness, while also trying to put this label of schizophrenia to, I think, further giving her appropriate treatment.
Thank you so much, Olivia. And Margot had about 1 minute and 54 seconds left and would like to reclaim her time and finish off her answer. So Rebecca, if you can set it to that, that would be great.
Thank you, Tash. Let me say this, that I think in trying to demonize, I would say, locked facilities, we forget that it's not just African Americans that are put in hospitals. Europe has locked facilities. France has hospitals to protect people who have serious mental illness in a crisis. So I think Germany does, and England does, and those are majority white countries, you know, so it isn't just African Americans in the United States. We're talking about human beings, and mental illness is a phenomenon across all cultures. African Americans do pay what we call the Black tax. We have to be more careful. Families have to be more vigilant. People are misdiagnosed, that is for sure. People are over-medicated. And my work is in helping families navigate the system and advocate for relatives to be vigilant and make sure that they are getting the best treatment. But I think we have to remember that 40% of people who have schizophrenia do not know that they are ill. And what are we going to do? Let them wander the street and die on the street like the woman on the front page of the Chronicle story yesterday, 28 years old and dead, would not accept treatment and nobody would bother to get it for her. Is that what we should do? And I don't think we can do. I wouldn't do it in my family. I haven't done it in my family. And I wouldn't advocate for anybody else to do it in their family, to just let things be when there is a nightmarish crisis in somebody's mind.
Thank you, Margot. So this wraps up this first round of questions. We have one more round of questions. And before I ask this question, I'm putting this into the chat. We're going to be asking our members afterwards, how do these positions and perspectives help advance DAC's demands? At the end of the day, DAC is going to be taking a position on whether or not we support locked facilities. And so as folks answer, I want you to think, take a look at the DAC website, decarceratealameda.org, take a look at our platform and really think about how, think about that as folks are answering.
Would you restate the question, Tash?
Yes, it's in the chat. It's how do these positions help advance DAC's demands? So our demands to decarcerate our jails, divest from jailing, and invest in community health. And so the question that all the speakers will be answering, I'll also be putting here in the chat. And we'll start off with Ivette because I know she had to leave 4 minutes ago. So thank you so much for staying over time, Ivette. Ivette, what is your your organization or JusticeLA's position on locked treatment facilities and why? Where is there common ground with folks who have positions that differ from yours?
Thanks, Tash. And you mentioned that conservatorship was in the ATI report. I want to make it clear that the Alternatives to Incarceration Work Group report was not just generated from JusticeLA. It was a year-long process with over 1,000 LA County stakeholders. So not every recommendation or every position in the report reflects the position of JusticeLA. But we did a lot of the heavy lifting around the writing. But ultimately, the ATI work group voted on the recommendations that they adopted. Even if they conflicted with ours. So much of JusticeLA's work has focused on law enforcement run locked facilities. And so the conversations that we've primarily had is around opposing any type of locked facility that is run by law enforcement. So I just want to make that clear. Like the question around like locked facilities in general, I think it's something that we have to really dig into, but we haven't gotten to that place because our focus has been decarcerating the jails, stopping any type of mental health jail facility, and cutting the funding of law enforcement to be able to invest in the community-based treatment that we've been advocating for, that I think we've all been advocating for generations. So I just want to make that distinction clear because I think the nuance around, hospital beds that are locked versus and run by medical professionals versus hospital beds that are locked by law enforcement, that's an issue. That's a distinction that we as a coalition haven't really dissected fully. And I think other folks have, more firm opinions or conclusion based on their medical expertise. I'm not a medical expert. What I've, from the organizing that I've done with medical experts, there's varying opinions, right? And there's varying opinions among family members, which we're hearing right now. So I could just say that the position of the coalition is no locked facilities run by law enforcement, period. Law enforcement has no business running any hospitals or any clinics or having any say on what treatment looks like. And then we take it a step further. There shouldn't be any law enforcement as security or any presence in medical facilities. So right now we're doing a campaign to get the sheriff's department out of hospitals because they've killed patients in hospitals just recently, a few weeks back. In UCLA Harbor Medical Facility. And so that's really what our position is. And in terms of folks with varying positions on that, again, even though there's difference of opinion in terms of whether or not to have locked beds in medical facilities, and we're talking about medical facilities not run by law enforcement, there is consensus among the medical professionals we work with and community members that law enforcement should have no part in that. So that's really where we've landed as a coalition, and being able to both present the data on folks, the level of service and the level of treatment that folks receive in community-based treatment facilities as opposed to large hospitals. That was really beneficial for us in stopping the creation of a mental health jail. Specifically, when we think about proximity to family and proximity to support networks. So when we're thinking about massive hospitals with like over 2,000 beds, which was what the county was trying to build here, that actually lowers the level of service, and creating centralized treatment actually separates families from their communities, separates folks from their support networks. And so that's why we've been advocating specifically not for the creation of hospitals, but for community-based treatment in order to facilitate the connection between different service networks, the connection between communities, which actually helps folks move through mental health crises and stabilize much more than locking them away in a large hospital that's away from their families and communities. So that's really our position right now, and I'm learning a lot from folks. One of the things around conservatorship is, a lot of family members that participated in the Alternatives to Incarceration work group process were concerned with what was raised, that they would have no power over providing their family member with treatment. And I think one place of convergence is the need to get to the root causes of harm. And I think what Olivia lifted up around these compounding traumas, right? Like not having access to housing, not having access to food security, exacerbating or creating mental health crises. And so that's one piece of convergence that we found, that investing into those root causes of harm or mental health illness is really where we find alignment.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ivette. I know you're like 10 minutes over time. You got another meeting to go to because you're a real ass community organizer. Thank you so much for supporting DAC time and time again. Just round of applause. Thank you so much for supporting us.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Don't work too hard. All right. Okay. Wow, that was so much in 5 minutes. Okay, so the next person, so all speakers get 5 minutes to answer these 2 questions. Thank you, Rebecca, for keeping time. And up next, we're going to go to Olivia. Olivia, what is your position on locked treatment facilities, and where do you share common ground with folks who may have a different take on this?
So I agree with Ivette, and I'm speaking. I am a representative of Do No Harm, but we as a group have not broached this topic. We've talked about it for years, but we haven't come to a conclusion. And I want to give like a little background about how I came here and how I came to my current stance, if I have one right now. Is that I spent my teen years in locked psychiatric facilities from 14 to 18. And I was just reflecting as I was driving home from Oakland. I had another patient who spent his 16th birthday in the hospital, and he was just so depressed, and it was another suicide attempt. I don't know if, I'm sure you've heard on the news, but the impact of COVID on our teenagers has been just brutal, and the rates of suicide attempts has skyrocketed, and there are not enough child and adolescent psychiatrists or therapists that will see kids without insurance or who are undocumented, or even places where we can safely place them. So they come to a regular hospital where like really no one is trained to be able to take care of them. I spent my 16th birthday. I spent every birthday and holiday in a locked facility, but I don't know, 16th I remember the most, I think, because I was looking out through like a barred window. And I didn't think about a future. Like I think I just came to that realization. People told me that I wouldn't make it to college. my friends from that era did not make it to college. They all ended up incarcerated in prison. It was straight from our locked adolescent psychiatric unit to prison. I literally saw one of my friends walk down the hallway on his 18th birthday in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the hands and ankles, go to prison for life. Yeah, so that's how I got. And then from then, I found myself at all proximities of jail cells and locked facilities. I've worked inside San Francisco County with the psychiatric department. I've worked inside 7L of San Francisco General, which is the locked, the forensic psych unit where people come from the various jails and prisons around the area. And I've been thinking about each of the individuals I have met along this journey and whether they have been served by being in a locked facility, a locked treatment facility. And I can only, of the dozens, I haven't kept count, but I can only think of one or two, I think, that have benefited. And those are the people who are severely criminally ill, who, have murdered several people, and, will, without, blinking an eye, tell you that they want to slit your throat with a knife and then, mutilate your body and then eat it. But otherwise, I don't think anyone, including myself, I think I've lost some telomeres or, some years of my life being in locked facilities, and also witnessing the trauma that my friends had to go through, for being oppositional or for just being fucking mad, excuse my language, that they had to, I had one friend who left home at 13, ran away from North Carolina and made it all the way to San Francisco because his family disowned him for being gay. And the only work that he could do was transactional sex work. And he was depressed and suicidal and somehow ended up incarcerated, but then they realized that he was suicidal, and then so brought him to the locked psychiatric facility, and he was really mad for so many good reasons. And he would scream, and they would just, lock him up in restraints in a padded room. I remember we weren't allowed to hug, and that was really painful. Yeah, and I definitely do not agree with having any sort of law enforcement in any sort of treatment facility, hospital, psychiatric facility. No, they do not belong there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Olivia. And I just want to remind, I just want to thank all of our speakers and all of our members for being here. This is not this is not an easy topic to discuss, and to please take care of yourselves as you can and as you're able to in this conversation. And thank you so much for our speakers for keeping it 100. Up next, I'm going to invite Katy Polony. Katy, what is your position? Why? And where do you share common ground with folks who may differ from yours? Katy, you are muted.
Sorry. I'm going to pivot from what I wrote and speak instead to what I experience in my work within IHOT. Because our job as a team is to try to persuade folks that are severely mentally ill to connect to community services. And it is, I'm not going to say impossible, it can happen, but it's extremely difficult and not the norm. What we do experience, what I experience as a family advocate, are families that have called for our help because their loved one is experiencing psychosis and has become dangerous to them. I have a friend who was stabbed 26 times, her throat was slit, her son, he needed treatment. He tried to kill her because of delusions that she now knows he was having. He has been sitting in Santa Rita for 3 years. He will probably go to prison, where what he needs is Napa. There are no beds for him in Napa for treatment. I try very hard to help the families I work with to get their loved ones hospitalized, because that's what they need. And I've worked with families where that has worked. They've gone into the hospital, they've gone to Villa Fairmont, they've been there for a period of a few months, they have come out of Villa, they have remained stable, they can live again at home peacefully, and even in many cases, going to their own treatment, engaging voluntarily in their own treatment. Without that, we cannot get people 5150. It is so difficult. They can be hurting themselves now. They can be threatening their family. They can be destroying furniture. They can be putting their fists through glass and cutting themselves, and we still can't get them 5150. So what the families are told to do then is to call the police, and the police say, get a restraining order. I have helped families in this last year, many of them, get restraining orders so that when they do call, when they're in danger, the police come and they can go to Santa Rita. We are, without proper treatment facilities, forcing people into incarceration. That is what families are told to do, is to turn their kids into criminals in order to remain safe. How we intersect with DAC is if we adequately treated people. We're not talking about incarceration. We're talking about a limited period of time for intense psychiatric care, including group and peer therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, whatever is going to work for the individual, and finding the medication that helps reduce the symptoms and take the torture away. My son tried to commit suicide. If it wasn't for hospitalization, these were command voices telling him to do it. If it wasn't for hospitalization, he would not be alive today. I'm absolutely positive of that. So we intersect with DAC in that we want to keep people out of prison. We are opposed to prisons becoming the default psychiatric institutions. We agree with what DAC calls for. We need more full service partnerships. We need more wraparound services. We need more wellness centers, more therapists. Right now, it's so hard to get a therapist. The wait is ridiculous. We need more crisis response teams with first responders not being the police. We need more supportive housing, licensed board and cares, underlined exclamation points. But without sufficient involuntary hospitalization for some, for a period of time, we're building a two-legged stool. We need all three. And I could end this with I could go on and on with stories. And I'm sorry, I'm becoming slightly incoherent here. Basically, we need our folks to be able to go to Villa Fairmont once they do maybe get into John George. The wait time in John George now for Villa is 8 weeks. They're not going to go. It isn't going to happen. People get cycled through John George over and over again because they are not sufficiently treated. They are brought in and kicked out, brought in and kicked out, ending up eventually on the streets and in jail. Villa having sufficient subacute facilities would help that situation.
Thank you so much, Katy. Let us go to Raia Small from Senior Disability Action to share her position and commonalities with folks that differ from hers.
All right, thank you. And thank you both so much, Olivia and Katy. So at Senior Disability Action, our position is that all people with disabilities deserve to live in the community and not in institutions long-term. And that means that we don't support the creation of new locked treatment facilities or laws that would force more people into treatment. It also means that we support people who want to leave nursing homes or other institutions and get the care they need to live at home. And for many people with disabilities, you know, the main reasons people are institutionalized are poverty and lack of housing and home care, not because there's any particular healthcare need that like they need to be in a hospital for. And yeah, the main reason we oppose locked treatment facilities is because no one wants to live in a hospital or in a prison. You know, pretty much everyone wants to live at home, and institutions are just rife with all kinds of abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And, you know, we see with the COVID pandemic how unsafe institutions are for seniors and people who are immune compromised. And they're also often unsafe for people with PTSD. And another reason that we oppose the forced treatment system is because it often leads to violence by police and traumatic churning of people through the mental health system, especially for Black people with disabilities. In San Francisco, I don't remember the exact statistic, but somewhere between like 35 and 40% of people held involuntarily are Black, and that's way disproportionate to the population. And among our members at Senior and Disability Action, there are definitely different opinions about forced treatment in the form of 5150 holds or 5250 holds and conservatorship. But our stance has generally been that we agree to oppose all expansion of the forced treatment system and to support voluntary treatment instead. So that doesn't, like, we haven't taken a campaign on to like kind of get rid of 5150s or to try to dismantle the system as it is, but more in terms of preventing it from growing or becoming more restrictive. And, you know, some people have personal experience that a 5150 hold was helpful to them, but also say it would have been more helpful to have gotten access to care before it became a crisis. And that seems to be a really common experience. And I guess in terms of finding common ground with people who disagree, it's actually not been that hard on this issue for us because I think that everyone agrees that more voluntary services are needed and that housing is like a big thing that's missing. So we worked on a campaign against the expansion of conservatorship in San Francisco under a state law called SB 1045, which some of you might be familiar with. Basically, it allowed 3 counties, including San Francisco, to expand conservatorship of people who are homeless and have a serious mental illness and substance use disorder. So basically it expanded the criteria from who's currently eligible to be conserved, so to be held involuntarily for longer than 2 weeks. And this law was particularly, you know, targeting homeless people who are visibly in distress, who are, you know, creating disturbances and bothering like businesses and, you know, other residents in the neighborhood. And the goal was really to get people off the streets and into treatment, but with an emphasis on, you know, getting people off the streets and not visible to the public. And so in terms of this particular law, like it targets about 100 people in San Francisco. So for us, it was pretty easy to say, like, whether you support this or not, like anything that's just going to address 100 people is not going to make a dent in homelessness. You know, like we probably all see more than 100 homeless people per day. Like this is not like a real solution. And to really emphasize that housing is what's missing, and housing is like what has been like divested from publicly. You know, especially when people say like, oh, why are there so many more people on the streets who appear to have mental illness than there were like 30 years ago? Like the answer isn't like because there's something, you know, like that, like more people need to be forced into treatment, but more people have lost their housing and they have not been able to access public housing. And yeah, just I guess working together with people who support voluntary treatment because, you know, it's the lowest barrier, it's easy to get into. We want it to be appealing so people want to do it if it's going to help them. And even if, conservatorship might work for a small number of people, it's not going to be the solution that we really need to invest in. So, yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Raia. Or Raia. I'm so sorry. Raia?
Raia, yeah.
Raia. Thank you so much, Raia.
Yeah,
Margot, let's go to you. You have 5 minutes to share your position on locked treatment facilities and commonalities you share with folks who differ from you.
Thank you, Tash. I am very glad that Ivette distinguished between locked beds in a jail and locked beds in a well-appointed, excellent psychiatric facility, which is what my group, the East Bay Supportive Housing Collaborative, supports the continuum of care where needed, hospitalization to stabilize, subacute beds for people who need a longer time to stabilize and understand their illness and the treatment that works for them, supportive housing on the outside, independent living when people can manage that, the continuum of care. And I think that is where we will have commonality. Hopefully, that we see the importance of excellent treatment and supportive facilities on a continuum of care. There's a lot of talk about the African American experience and being overly diagnosed and overly incarcerated. And I think it's very important to see that good treatment prevents incarceration. And that is our position, that you give people quality treatment, quality services, quality housing, and that prevents incarceration. My story is about my sister in the 40s in a stressful job, person with great sense of humor and bright and a beautiful singing voice, but a stressful job in her 40s, decompensated. Became very ill, began hearing voices on the phone, odd messages, became aggressive toward our mother verbally. And then she was physically aggressive. And her siblings took the step to hospitalize her. I was in the lead. She went to John George. She was there maybe 7 or 8 hours. She was released to the streets with an address of a women's shelter in San Francisco, to which she didn't go. She couldn't come back to the family home. She went from motel to motel. She liked libraries. She saw a woman in the library she thought was following her. She hit her. She was arrested. She went to jail. And she has never, ever accepted treatment. 10 years later, she's on the streets of Los Angeles, homeless in this COVID period. And all we can do is hope that CareFirst Jail Last will find her, will sweep her into a service of some kind and get her inside, even though she doesn't like to be in a motel where there's television, because the electronic surveillance features frighten her. I would 5150 her again if I thought it would help, if I could be there to help, which I can't because I don't know where she is on the streets. I think we should have CareFirst, Jail Last, like Los Angeles. I've been calling there. I think we could agree that we need a good system of referral and support for people who are homeless and try to get them housed. I've called Los Angeles. It's amazing, so different from Alameda County. There's a 24-hour line from behavioral health itself. It's not contracted out. You call, they can tell you where there are food kitchens, where the crisis workers are, where one could get a room. It's a very integrated service. Where we can work is on the racism that's in the system. I hear people complain about it, but other than my colleagues who are here today, there is no support for it. I don't see anybody calling for a system that is mandatory for psychiatrists to take around implicit bias, for healthcare workers to take around understanding the practice of over-medication. I think we can work on that. I think we can work on more beds for people who are duly diagnosed. There are many people that are substance abuse users and who have mental illness. There are insufficient number of beds and they need to be treated, those two conditions simultaneously. We can work on that.
Thank you, Margot. And last but not least, we will wrap up this panel with comments from Clio and their position on locked treatment facilities.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for their experiences and bringing so much of themselves to this. My position is that abolition must include ending locked treatment facilities. My position is informed by my experience developing bipolar 1 with manic episodes and psychosis 4 years ago. And for a content warning, I'm going to be talking about domestic and sexual violence, police violence, and medical abuse. So feel free to mute if you need to. In the aftermath of a relationship that turned harmful with my former partner stalking and harassing me, I became hypervigilant and paranoid. I was terrified of him, and my terror bled over into fear and obsession with the security state and surveillance. Friends were confused with how to support me. I looked like shit, according to one friend, makeup smeared, adopting a radically different gender presentation, talking in floods of words, and believing that friends, abolitionists, mind you, were undercover agents of the federal government. My manic states and destabilized housing, being read as homeless and a sex worker, led to multiple instances where concerned strangers called 911. Although I'm a mixed race person of Middle Eastern descent, my white skin privilege shaped all of these encounters. While I was forced, pinned, restrained, and humiliated by police, I did not experience the violence that so often targets BIPOC folks. During these episodes of mania, I was arrested and taken to jail many times, and more often I was taken to locked beds. I was forced institutionalized in some of the institutions we've been talking about tonight, in Los Angeles, Santa Monica, Sylmar, San Francisco, San Leandro, and Portland, Oregon. It did come that I began to beg to be taken to jail rather than be put in psychiatric hold. During psychiatric holds, I was restrained and pinned and force medicated with booty juice, the slang term for a powerful combination of sedatives and antipsychotics injected into the butt. I'm going to focus on John George Psychiatric Pavilion because it's in Alameda County and it's where they take poor people with 5150s. And in my opinion, it's the worst hospital that I've been held at. And yeah, at the risk of repeating things that people have said, John George was opened in 1992 as kind of a regional clearinghouse for people in need of acute psychiatric care. John George is kind of infamous here. The emergency room at John George holds people of all genders in one crowded space. The ratio is steep leaning toward men, so gender nonconforming people and women are in the minority. There are no beds in the emergency room, just crowded floors with mats to sleep under, never turned off fluorescent lights. The food is legendary terrible, and the care is widely known to be negligent and disrespectful. Just before my first hospitalization there was a local news expose on what they described as third world conditions at John George, a racist and coded way of describing how bad the facility is. And in 2015, the staff wrote an open letter saying that John George was a crisis of its own. If you want more testimonials of the experience at John George, I would actually recommend you read John George's Yelp. What comes up over and over in the testimonials on Yelp, which is definitely a problematic forum and doesn't give a good picture of who's there, is the comparison to jail or prison. A number of people describing it as worse. And we can approach that saying jail and prison are definitely worse and it's offensive to compare them, or we can listen to what the people are telling us when they say John George is, in Lawrence T's words, like a prison, the treatment is positively inhumane. Avoid at all costs. Jamie S. says, it is a nightmare, nothing at all like any other psychiatric facility I've been to. It is more like jail. There's multiple accounts on the Yelp that caution readers to never go there and describe increased suicidal ideation after being hospitalized there. Jessica H. writes simply, if I could give 0 stars, I would. This hospital does nothing to help your mental illness. All they do is cause more trauma. The nurses need to be more training and don't treat you like patients, more like prisoners. I could go on. A place where I find common ground with what I've heard other people saying is just the question of what to do instead when loved ones are experiencing mental health crisis and suicidality, and just the question of what to do, just like the question we asked of what to do in the absence of jails or prisons. Also supporting the alternative community-based care and on treatment on demand that I've heard people talking about. We know that prisons and jails further trauma and warehouse people in inhumane treatment. I urge Decarcerate Alameda County to take a stand against locked beds or forced psychiatric treatment. Thank you.
Awesome. I just that wraps it up for our panel discussion. I really, really am so grateful for everybody who came and shared and took times out of their evenings to speak with us today. You really brought your full selves with so much integrity and courageousness. And I just, in whatever way all of our members can visually thank you online, I just want to give you a round of applause and so much gratitude and appreciation for coming. All of you, Ivette, Olivia, Katy, Raia, Margot, Clio, thank you so much for bringing all of your genius, your brilliance, and this history and context and sharing with us. So just thank you. Yes, we learned so much. So with this, I know we have a member discussion up next, and I want to invite our panelists to leave if you need to leave, if you need to take care of yourselves, if you need to have dinner, take care of your loved ones. Please do not feel like you have to stay here. We'll just be doing some reflections and discussions. So yeah, thank you so much for coming.
If you'd like to stay, we would love for you to stay.
Yeah, you're welcome to stay. We'll be talking for the next 20 minutes or so. So with that, I'm going to pass it to John and Rebecca, who are going to facilitate the member discussion. We did have a guiding question for the members. John just put it in the chat. How do these positions help advance our demands? I also imagine a lot came up that you all want to talk about too. So, but I'm going to pass the torch on to John and kind of let him make that facilitator's executive decision on how to hold this space.
So yeah, it's been a lot. It's been amazingly rich testimony, insight, information, experience. So what I want to ask, if Rebecca, if you can help facilitate this too, is to